Hi, do you want to know how to start your own podcast the right way? Or do you also want to know how you can get someone else to help handle your podcast so that you can focus on just being on the podcast, interviewing your guests, instead of getting caught up with admin and project management work? Well, hi, it's Linh Podetti here, founder of Outsourcing Angel, and in this video, you're going to learn from my own virtual assistant, Juvy Alvarez, who have helped me to handle my own podcast, as well as sharing her experience working in a podcast production company. She will run through from A to Z everything you need to know before starting a podcast. Hi Juvy. So in today's video, I really want to talk about podcasts because I think more and more people are starting their own podcasts because they realize that it's a powerful method or channel of actually getting your story out, building a brand. And so you have helped me with my own podcast, and you've actually worked in a company that actually did podcast production for people. So I just thought it would be really amazing for you to share what people need to know before they start a podcast. So welcome, Juvy.
Thank you, Miss Lynn, and glad to have you here. Basically, before when I was working with a podcast production company, the thing that we asked to prepare for the client is to have the preparation of the podcast name, because it would be a disaster if you haven't have the thoughts of the name first. And then there's the podcast structure. So most of that structure is what's the hook, and then the introduction, how the host will introduce himself or herself, and then what's the content, and then obviously if you wanted to have the outro. So that's more of for the structure that you want it to go. And then comes the cover image, because that's very important. Does it consist to have the logo or end with a host only?
Actually, let's go back to the beginning part, because that's actually quite important, because don't just start a podcast without really understanding what is the goal of this podcast. Are you hoping to attract leads for your business, or is it just really connection with the potential clients or network that you want to connect with? So when I was
building names.
Exactly. So really understanding what are you trying to do, and then the type of audience or the type of guest that you want to attract into it, then which will really help you with your name. Unless you're clear, you can't just think of just a random name. And then really deciding as well of whether it's going to be just you interviewing that person, or you're co-hosting with someone, or sometimes is it just you sharing content, right? Because for me, when I was doing the Kind Boss podcast, I was basically just interviewing guests, and my goal was to add value to my audience, build deeper connection with my guests.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's the niche the podcast for? So
now that we're clear on what is this all about and your strategy, now we're talking about the actual cover image. And in my case, I put my photo in there because I'm trying to build my brand, and it was kind of the Kind Boss show. And I guess the Kind Boss for me was I wanted to attract entrepreneurs, but also someone of the kind quality. So I had a particular guest that I was looking for. So what are some examples that other people that have come to you to help with their podcast? What are some variations of their cover images or their names?
Some others just use their own, the logo with their business or the name of their the podcast. But it's one thing that I just realized, that it's easier to get your podcast logo or image, to get approved if there is the image of the host itself. It's more on once you apply, if you need a hosting, right? The podcast host where you want it to be hosted. So the one thing that I really realized is that it's easier to get it approved if the image is, so it's still more the looks.
Okay. So you can actually get disapproved from the hosting, podcast hosting, if your thumbnail doesn't look right.
Yep.
And if
it matters.
Yeah. So if you have podcast image of yourself or your logo, are you saying that it has more chance of being approved?
Yes.
And if it's so they actually pre-qualify if it doesn't look nice, it might just ruin their whole
So sometimes if you just use only text only, sometimes it got disapproved. Perhaps they might think that it's only for scam or other purpose. So
And not a
that's why
serious
having the image for the host really like it just gets approved right away.
Yeah. So here we're talking still with the production side of thing, and then after that we'll talk into like actually publishing and or editing it and then hosting it. But back to the putting it together, I remember when I was doing my podcast, we decided to choose hire a voiceover artist to give that little intro, just so that it creates that kind of professionalism aspect to it. Whereas some other clients you probably have worked with is that they chose to just do their own intro, right? They're like, "Hi, it's Lynn here," da 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 da, and yeah, like, what's your advice around having a professional intro versus like just yourself speaking?
It really doesn't matter as long as, like, let's say you just wanted to have that introduction by your own, not the professional type. It depends on also how you introduce yourself. And what I mean is the introduction of what the podcast is about. But yeah, having the professional voiceover it still sounds cool. Because
So up until this point in time, when it comes to like creating thumbnail and okay, now we're up to the editing part, right? So this is where you would need a team, right? So what kind of virtual assistance was actually helping the clients at the podcast place that you're working with, or even with ourselves? Like what team do we consist of in order to actually produce podcasts?
For the team, one is you need really like a video editor or audio editor, because that's the soul of the podcast, because that is where everything plays. And then if the editor can do a bit of animation for the introduction, then that's great. And then he should know how to also edit the audio, because if the audio is bad, it's really useless. Like, you'd rather not publish it rather than to risk it. So that's very important. And then somebody that can help you with, so we are talking about production, right? So that can help with publishing and make sure that the schedule is on top of that. And then with adding description, if that VA can do, or you can hire a writer, so that can help for the description. And then an admin type of person that can help, let's say, reaching out clients. Reaching out those guests. So getting all the information before the production, before the recording. So what will be sending, perhaps like what will be the discussion on the interview, what the topics. And then if there is a particular, let's say they have a webinar coming up, and then they wanted that to, I think it's best to publish this on this day, because it might be the best topic to also have it spread out. So that's also one thing that really helps, that gets useful, having that podcast show to be published.
Yeah. So ideally, would you recommend once a week podcast show that people do, or what's the frequency?
Yes. Yeah, I think once a week is already like good enough. But if like you do not have that type of like a lot of people on your place, then at least like twice a month is good enough.
Yeah.
So yeah, because they can repurpose actually. So
yeah. So you raise a good point where you talk about animation. So that means that because with podcasts, you can choose to actually edit and upload it onto a YouTube channel. And so it's visual, or you can use the audio version and put it into the podcast hosting site, right?
Yeah.
And when it comes to the resource help, we personally at OA have used a team to produce our podcast. And I would say that you would probably need one person that does the admin, like you were saying, like being able to reach out to guests and liaise to get their bio, to get their photos, to update them on, remind them when the podcast is on, remind them of how to present themselves. But maybe that person could also have basic Canva design skill to actually edit your thumbnail, because every thumbnail of a guest
every episode.
Yeah,
there's different thumbnail. Yes.
Yeah, every episode we feature us and the guests, so that it's always a new image. So that's also something that you would need help with. And if you do a podcast project on your own, I think it can get really time consuming. And the big part is even the editing bit. So we have a VA that is specialized in doing just the editing on its own, right? Video production and audio editing to get it done. Whereas an admin VA is more of someone that could help with project managing it throughout the whole process.
Yes.
Including probably
including like social media posting. So yes.
Yeah, that's right. So talk to me more about now the hosting. So you've got the production side set out. So you've got the episode, you've got all the assets that you're ready to go. Where do you actually host this?
So for hosting, like the number one that you really need is to get the RSS. So what RSS means is like a really simple syndication. It is more on like an XML based format for sharing and distributing web content. So in layman's term, RSS allows you to subscribe a news feed from your favorite website. So that is where also like it also benefits the users who wants to receive timely updates from their favorite websites or to aggregate data from the many sites. So hosting, there's a lot actually. And then I'm biased, so I have my own favorite. So when we are using here in like the kind boss, we use the Anchor because that's a free host. So we don't need to have it published from with other podcast personnel. So we just have this one off only, like Anchor works best. But other things with that is that the Omny Studio is very great one, also very easy to use, very user friendly. So any VA can maneuver that without any troubles. Libsyn, that is also a good one. SoundCloud, yes, and then there's more on top 5, the Buzzsprout, Podbean, Simplecast, Megaphone, Bluehost. But I haven't tried that yet. It's one of the most of the top 10, so kind of like host. So
that's iTunes and Spotify.
iTunes and Spotify, there are the platforms. That is where the RSS will be like crawl into. You get the RSS from the host. So that is like, let's say for example in Libsyn. So you get the RSS from Libsyn, have that in your Spotify, in your Google Podcast, and then in iTunes. So that is where they will crawl in. So once you publish one episode in the host, so for let's say for example focus on in Anchor. So once you publish that, by tomorrow, it mostly like around 12 to 24 hours, RSS feed will crawl into those other platforms.
Yeah.
So yeah.
How about actually I forgot to talk about the setup. What are some of the recommendation of tools do you need for recording? Do you recommend certain microphone and equipment, anything that you think is important to actually make a really good podcast?
I can't give any recommendations because I never been to podcast, but it's mostly my boss was the one who really recommends something that is really great. So you should consider a good microphone. And then, the background wise, actually, I always keep on asking him to ask the guests to turn off their AC because it's easier and then it sounds better without any background noise, because in a good microphone, even the sound of an AC can be heard.
Yeah.
So, and it matters.
Yeah. So in terms of the microphone, I'm currently using a Blue Yeti Nano. So this is what it looks like there. I think it's supposed to be good. And I think it's just as important to have good lighting and just a clear background.
Exactly.
Right. Turning off the air conditioner is really important so that you could get the best production out there. Okay, so now that you've got published, the most important thing, I guess, is promotion. It's how do people even find this? How do other people find our own podcast? Can you share with that?
So with that production already, so we already have that in place. Mostly once it's published, you get to publish that firstly in your website. Yes, so it's an updated in a weekly or whatever you want your podcast to be published. And then YouTube is a good place as well. So that is where if the podcast is have the video, because it's for me, I'd rather watch in YouTube rather than just listen to the audio only.
Same, yeah.
I can't relate if I'm only listening to it. It gets me sleepy. So I'd rather have that in a video. And then in Facebook, of course, pages or in personal Facebook with that get from your own let's say publications. And then social media, snippets in IG. And also because there's a limit in Instagram, you can't post the whole episode. And also in LinkedIn, that is where you can get most of professional listeners as well. So anyway, those really also wanted to just listen them while they're driving or in a gym. So that is where they wanted to hear, to listen to it in a platform. So either they want it in iTunes or whatever. So
yeah. So what you're trying to say is a VA could actually help you or your team could basically help you to now repurpose your podcast and promote it. So cutting into snippets for social media and then writing on a blog post on website and actually marketing it yourselves, letting your guest speaker know that you've published it so they could also promote it as well, because it comes down to, it's not just about publishing it on these hosting sites and thinking that's it. You really have to do a bit of your marketing to build an audience for your business. And I think for me, one of the biggest benefit that I got from podcasts was building a deeper connection with my guest speaker. It's like if you ask someone to, hey, let's have a 15-minute coffee or a chat, it's kind of like, no, I'm busy, I don't have time. But if you ask them, hey, would you like to be on my podcast? And you interview that person, they know that you're going to be creating content that they can share it with other people, and they get to share their expertise. And I find that much less awkward and more chance of them saying yes, because there's value for them rather than just picking their brain for 15 minutes. And then I end up building really strong relationship with that person, and they ultimately refer me to other clients or refer me to partners, or they even potentially became a client of our service. So that's what I love about podcast. Is there anything you want to add to that benefit?
Yeah, and then so it works both ways when speaking with us, talking about benefits, right? So you as the host will get benefits from those guests, and those guests also will get benefit from you, because it's more on getting them to spread the word. It's more on, hey guys, you have your own number of followers. You explain to them, you just share about this person. So that person will also be heard or be known to your own audience. On the other hand, your guests, they have the different audience, and then they will also share that because they're happy, especially if there's an upcoming events on their way. So it's really great to observe that. So the VA helping with publishing on those things should be really have the keen to see, okay, so do you have any ongoing or whatever webinar or courses ongoing, and then you want this to be published on these days. So even for the post-production, something like that. So sharing with snippets only in Instagram, that helps a lot. For them.
Yeah, thank you, Juvy. So tell me more about your role when you were actually project managing the podcast production. I wanted you to kind of run through what your typical day looked like, and who did you have to manage, and how did you make the process run smoothly?
When I was doing that, mostly I was the person who managed the entire team, the behind the scenes. So the editor, the designer, or writer. And then also reaching out to those clients on those important details that I need. And then even we have a spreadsheet prepared for what podcast should we publish for this day and for this particular client. And then I just need to also have that in their own separate spreadsheets, wherein that client, I just have to check, hey, we have this description in place. Let me know if everything is good, and then we are good to go. Or you have some other changes, because sometimes it happens on that same week, they just say, oh, Juvy, can you please delay this episode and then get this other one instead? So I have to check with the team as well to make sure that's why I always have them to get a month in advance with the editing and everything, especially with editor, the video editor and audio, because that is where it's eating a lot of time. So if everything is already ready there, and then I have also to double check everything. Sometimes they just miss that there are video wherein there's a gap, so it doesn't sit well. So I have to check on that. And then so more on QA. That's how I really roll before.
Yeah, I really like it, because when I was doing my podcast, I had Cedar, who was assigned as a project manager. And because really you need someone on top of the whole project and liaise with each person, rather than if you have to deal with each person doing video editing and it comes to you, you just become, it can get overwhelming as a business owner. You don't want to get stuck in the production of this podcast. You want to still networking. Because the other tip that I've heard from another guest in the past is that after you're doing a podcast, it's really about building the relationship on outside of the podcast,
Keep
nurturing,
going.
nurturing that relationship with the person you just spoke to, rather than just thinking this was the podcast thing. But if you get caught up in the production and publishing of your podcast, you just won't have time to do that. So thank you so much, Juvy, for sharing all that. Do you want to leave any last piece of advice if someone is thinking about starting a podcast this year?
So far, it just needs to for them to make sure that they know what's the purpose of the podcast, rather than just have a podcast because it's the in now. So having that in place, firstly, it would do better. It's more on it also helps with a VA on where can they help better. So rather than ask the VA, what do you think should we go? Because they don't do the thinking, they just do the doing. So they can help suggest if they are more experienced, but still with a podcast for those clients, they should ask their friends or even with you, what do you think is the best? What's the purpose of your podcast? Where it would benefit you and your listeners.
Yeah, totally. And because of my goal when I was doing a podcast is that I wanted to build the relationship with my guest speaker, I really felt I achieved that, because that's what I got. I got referrals, I got people coming back to me as a partner, etc. But sometimes people do podcasts for popularity and wanting to have the most downloads and the most views, and then they can kind of get, I guess, misled to a different path. What is the goal? My goal is to get more clients, even if it's low views, low on the podcast, but I'm still achieving the outcome that I'm after, which made
the quality over quantity type.
Quality over the quantity of views. Yep. Well, thank you so much, Juvy. Really appreciate your time sharing your experience with podcasting.
Thank you, Miss Lynn. I appreciate also for having me here. And bye.
Well, thank you so much for watching, guys. If you have any questions for me, love to hear from you in the comments below. Otherwise, we have more videos for you to watch over here.